Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you may be when you join us. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. My name is Nicolas Bouchet. I am a research fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and it's my pleasure and honor to be the host for this event, which marks the launch of a new paper, which has just gone online right about a couple of hours ago, titled "How Its War on Ukraine Killed Russia's Hydrogen Ambitions." The paper is by Aliaksei Patonia, who is a ReThink.CEE fellow of the GMF, as well as a research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. And he will be presenting his paper. And we will be then joined by Quitzow, who is research group leader for global energy transition politics and policy at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam in Germany. We will be also joined a little bit later on by Margarita Balmaceda, who is professor in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton University in the US, as well as an associate at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Professor Balmaceda is coming straight from a different event, so she will be joining in a few minutes' time. So just to briefly give the running order, I will ask first Alex to give a presentation. He will share a PowerPoint giving the highlights and the main points of his research. After which I will ask Rainer and Margarita, when she joins us, to make quick commenting interventions for a short while. And after that, we will open for a Q&A and discussions. Feel free at any point to post questions in the chat function, and I will pick them up and share them and distribute them as we go along. As I've mentioned, we are being recorded, so this presentation will also be available on the YouTube channel of GMF at a later date. On that note, I will just hand over to you, Alex, to start your presentation, and you share your screen, and we will give you about 10 to 15 minutes to do this, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, everyone who have already joined, and obviously for this great opportunity to share some of the insights on hydrogen in Russia, and obviously the war Russia's basically waging on Ukraine at the moment. So I will, just as Nick said, start sharing the presentation. Yes, and as mentioned, this presentation is about the paper that has already been released by GMF. The paper is about hydrogen, Russian war in Ukraine, how those two things are interconnected and related, and what that means for Europe and the rest of the world. So I'll start with just a very simple question: why hydrogen? Why are we even discussing this? Well, simply because hydrogen is considered to be by many researchers, energy practitioners and policymakers as the future savior of the planet. I'm not saying it's ideal, but it has already been included in many energy strategies around the world as the decarbonizing fuel of the future. Just because it does not produce CO2 emissions when incinerated, it can also be used as a fuel, as a feedstock for the production of many substances like chemicals, also for steel making, aluminum, also to produce power and heat houses, residential buildings and commercial buildings as well. So it's a very much versatile performer and a potential savior of our planet, as it has been dubbed by many. So as you can see from this map, hydrogen has already been included in many business plans around the world, and most importantly, Europe and countries like Japan and South Korea have included hydrogen development projects and also hydrogen import on their agenda. Whereas some other countries like the US, Canada, for instance, Chile, Australia, they are thinking about producing hydrogen for export. As you can see from this slide, hydrogen market is also expected to basically undergo a significant rise. By 2030, the market will almost quadruple, as expected by many business practitioners. The bad news for those who are very much environmentally cautious, for tree-hugging creatures and people like myself, is that hydrogen is currently being produced mostly from fossil fuels, natural gas being the main feedstock, and also coal and a little bit of oil, but that only goes to oil refining mostly. So renewable hydrogen is what we need in principle. That's the holy grail of decarbonization, but at the moment we are not at that stage. So we are thinking about, when we're thinking about colors of hydrogen, basically hydrogen per se is the same color, but the way we produce hydrogen defines the basically the future of energy system and also the future of our economy. So green hydrogen is hydrogen produced from renewable power and water by the process called electrolysis. So it does not emit any CO2. Blue hydrogen is the next best form of hydrogen, hydrogen produced from natural gas with the technology called carbon capture and storage, where no CO2 emissions are basically interfering the atmosphere and entering the atmosphere. They are kept underground. But unfortunately, as mentioned, gray and brown hydrogen, hydrogen produced from natural gas or coal, are the two most common types of hydrogen that are being used right now. So a lot of countries, as mentioned, have already issued their hydrogen strategies, with Japan starting the process in 2017, and the EU releasing its hydrogen strategy in July 2020. Countries like Russia are a little bit lagging behind. So that does not mean that they are not really considering hydrogen to be an important factor for their development in the future. So what were Russian hydrogen plans before their full-scale invasion of Ukraine this February? Because Russia is the country with the biggest discovered deposits of natural gas, Russia was very much expecting hydrogen to be a new market for them. A market where they could take up to 20% of, the entire market could be, 20% of the entire market could potentially be taken by Russian hydrogen. That was the expectation. And that would generate up to 100 billion USD annually. That was their plan, and for that plan, they created a hydrogen atlas of 18 projects, 33 projects in 18 different regions of the country. As you can see from the map, some of them were supposed to be dedicated specifically to green hydrogen, but the most viable from the financial point of view and technical point of view would be those dedicated to blue hydrogen because of natural gas and the process and the technologies that has already been available. From the techno-economic perspective, that was almost a perfect plan, because natural gas infrastructure that Russia possesses, the one that leads Russian natural gas to Europe, could potentially be adjusted for hydrogen. That means Russia, in case it develops its hydrogen industry, would have a relatively cheap means to deliver hydrogen to Europe. Obviously, that hydrogen will be of relatively cheap cost because of the low production costs. And that also means that Russia could also use geological potential for CCS, meaning that it could produce not just gray hydrogen from natural gas, but it could also utilize its depleted gas fields, for instance, or salt caverns to produce blue hydrogen. So the main expectation was to produce enough hydrogen to cover the European market, or basically replace natural gas with hydrogen, because of the factors mentioned before. And the two runners-up, the two most important secondary markets would be Japan and South Korea, because of the sheer volume of import those countries were trying to have with respect to hydrogen. There was also socio-political factors that would strengthen Russia's position in this respect. First and foremost, there was still no strong anti-Russian sentiments in the European countries, meaning that there was no unified position with respect to the imports of Russian energy projects at that time, meaning there were still politicians who would lobby for Russia and who would potentially represent Russian interests. What changed after the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? I'm not saying the start of the war, because the war started in 2014, but after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, quite a lot has changed. And most importantly, those key markets that where the Russian hydrogen was supposed to be delivered, and by saying this, I mean European Union, Japan, and South Korea, would no longer be potential markets for Russian hydrogen because of the sanctions and because of the overall understanding of how political energy products could be in this respect, and how much Russia could play on its monopoly. So Russia has to reorient its hydrogen export to other markets. And by saying other markets, I mean primarily Asia and China, because China is the only market, potential market of hydrogen that could potentially substitute Europe in terms of volume and in terms of how much hydrogen it may consume. So the new plans for Russia with respect to China would be to produce at least 1.4 million tons, not 2.2 as it was planned before. And also to deliver that hydrogen was supposed to be delivered to China by different means, but most importantly by pipelines. For instance, Power Siberia 2, which has not been completed yet, but that was the plan. So they are supposed to generate around 12.8 billion USD per year. That is the plan, but there are obviously challenges to that. For instance, only the generation of hydrogen would need at least 21 billion US dollars just to create the generation capacity. And I'm not even saying anything about the infrastructure. So the infrastructure will need a lot more. And most importantly, the most important question here is, will China be able to buy that Russian hydrogen? In my opinion, as you can see from the paper, when you read it, I would claim that China will most probably not buy Russian hydrogen, at least at the extent Russia was originally planning to do. So China is way more cautious than the European Union when it comes to hydrogen. It also includes gray and brown hydrogen in its energy strategy and decarbonization strategy. Chinese hydrogen industry is pretty much at an early stage, but China has already become the world's #1 producer of hydrogen by volume. China is also actively developing its CCUS technologies, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which means it can produce blue hydrogen without relying on Russia, because Russia does not have its operating facilities, CCUS operating facilities at the moment. And China is also one of the most important producers of alkaline electrolyzers, the most powerful electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen. There are also socio-political factors, but in principle, Chinese hydrogen approach rests on the premises that the hydrogen industry of China will be dedicated to domestic markets, not like the Russian hydrogen concept that is strongly export-oriented. Chinese concept is more dedicated, is primarily dedicated to the domestic markets, which means China will need to create jobs domestically. It will also need to develop technologies domestically. So it will all be dedicated to domestic consumption, at least at the very early stage. What does that mean for Europe and the rest of the world? So for Europe, that means there will most probably not be sufficient supplies of cheap fuel or cheap hydrogen, which means that the decarbonization of Europe will slow down, and the buildup of the European hydrogen strategy and the European hydrogen sector would also slow down just because of the sheer volume that they will need to, of hydrogen that they will need to import from elsewhere. And in most cases, it will be hydrogen that will be a lot more costly than the Russian one because of the mentioned factors. For the rest of the world, for global implication, that means that China will be the country that will most likely gain from this. It will be able to get steady supplies of relatively cheap fuel and cheap feedstock, natural gas and coal. That will mean that China will have the chance to decarbonize faster using Russian natural gas. It will also mean that it will have enough time to build up really strong dominant hydrogen industry. In this case, if Europe and the US do not really build their hydrogen sectors, we will end up in a world where one country might be dominating the entire energy landscape. This basically concludes my presentation. I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Not least for writing a great paper from which, as a non-energy person, I learned a huge amount, but also for the timekeeping on this presentation. You went through a lot in a short time. I can only warmly recommend that you read the paper, and I also would like to comment, Alex, because the war completely changed his plans, and he had to basically rewrite a paper entirely after February from what he was originally planning to do. So I think it was in many ways a very heroic piece of research and rewriting. We've also been joined now by Margarita Balmaceda, which I can welcome to this event. Rainer, I'll hand over to you for your comments, and you have about 6-7 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Margarita. You're muted, Rainer.
Sorry about that. Sorry. It happens all the time. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah. So glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Alex, for an interesting paper and an interesting presentation. And I think what's maybe most interesting are the broader implications that you touched on towards the end, and I'll try to sort of work my way towards that as well in my comments. And I think, I mean, the main sort of saddest implication of all of this is, of course, not just that Germany or Europe won't be able to import hydrogen from Russia, but of course that this puts a damper also on Russian decarbonization, which wasn't necessarily high on the agenda before the war, but now obviously is off the agenda more or less entirely. And I think that's like I said, the saddest part of all of this, the war in general, that when we need to really cooperate with Russia, both for our European transition, but also for Russia's transition, we're not able to do that. And of course, Russia would have really needs Western cooperation on technology and other things to really also make that happen in a way that works for Russia, that works for the Russian economy. And actually hydrogen, not only the production of hydrogen, but also the use of hydrogen might have been an area where Russia might have benefited. For example, Russia has currently, due to the abundance of natural gas in Russia, already has a lot of steel making that is based on what's called direct reduction, direct reduced iron as an alternative way for steel making, which uses either natural gas or hydrogen in a low carbon or even in a zero carbon way if hydrogen is used. So this actually presented a pathway for Russia to enter this future climate neutral economy. And like I said, it's a pity that this avenue is closed for now. And I think also, as Alex pointed out correctly, I mean, this really shifts access to Russian natural gas and resources more general, obviously, to China. China has easier access to those markets now due to routes being closed to Europe. Important export markets for Russia in Europe are no longer there. So that means there's a pivot to China, and which is not obviously entirely a bad thing. Like Alex said, more natural gas in China also means that China can decarbonize more quickly, possibly also in the power sector, shift as a transitional strategy from coal to gas, more so than it might have in the absence of this situation. But from a geopolitical point of view, yes, I mean, it means that this broader implication, not just for hydrogen, but for sort of building future climate neutral industries, China gains. China has access to raw materials that also Europe. So what does that mean for Europe and the US? It means that, of course, Europe and the US need to focus more on developing partnerships with other countries to access these kinds of raw materials, critical raw materials for various supply chains, but also natural gas, which has some negative knock-on effects, as we know, because it's sort of putting those fossil fuel projects back on the agenda in countries where dialogue was trying to move them in other directions prior to the war, and now Europe is sending signals. Yeah, we need your gas. Let's invest in fossil fuel extraction. I mean, there was an agreement that I think G7 countries wouldn't be, or OECD countries wouldn't be investing overseas in fossil fuel extraction anymore. This has changed. This is no longer being adhered to, which again is of course problematic if we're thinking of decarbonization. I'm not sure if I should be wrapping up here, but I think the main thing this really means also for Europe, I think, is in terms of accessing these critical raw materials that would have maybe come from Russia. It also means not only building partnerships abroad, but also really taking on the challenge of really extracting them in Europe, in the European Union, something that hasn't really been on the agenda because it's not particularly popular for those regions that are affected by it. I don't think it's popular anywhere if it happens right in your backyard, but I think it's a reality that Europe is going to have to face to build a resilient sort of raw material supply over time. I think the US is much more proactive at going down that path. In Europe, it's politically very difficult, but I think it's a reality Europe will have to face, and that's also an implication from this sort of scenario that Alex has described with a focus on hydrogen, but that has a much broader scope at the end of the day.
Thank you, Elena. Margarita, I'll come over to you, and once again, welcome to this event. I'm looking forward to hear what you have got to say.
Many thanks for the invitation, and
You're muted again.
It's a great pleasure to read this paper, also because Aliaksei is also a fellow at the IASS, and I haven't met him in person yet, but I'm, especially after reading this paper, I really am, and it's extremely interesting. So I think some of the reasons why this paper is so interesting is not only because of the information it provides, but because of the questions that it presents to us and the questions it leaves open. And I would simply like to flag a few of these issues and questions. Perhaps we could discuss them in more detail later, which I think are some of these questions are fully fleshed out in the paper, some are not, but I think they're worth of our attention. The first thing that I found very interesting, and I think it's worthwhile thinking perhaps more deeply about, is take a one more step further in our consideration of the role of sanctions in terms of Russia's ability to export hydrogen. I think I think it would be useful to differentiate between different types of technology that Russia may need here, and how these different technologies are affected by the sanctions. Also, I am a little bit more skeptical than Aliaksei is about the willingness of European markets to take on Russian hydrogen in the future. Being in Germany, I hear every day calls for going back to imports of Russian natural gas. And I wouldn't be surprised if after the war is finished, there might be people willing to continue an energy relationship with Russia, perhaps not with natural gas, but perhaps with hydrogen. So I'm a little bit more modest in my expectations here. I also found extremely interesting the discussion of the mediums and how these different options concerning transportation of hydrogen interface with the issue of the infrastructure that is there and how this infrastructure could be used. Again, this, in my view, is related to a variety of views about how that energy relationship with Russia may be continued or not in the future and in what form. Obviously, it has to do with the idea of whether Nord Stream 2 will ever be used again or not, or whether other pipelines are to be used. But it also concerns the whole issue of the infrastructure that is in line to be built with to export natural gas to China, whether that infrastructure could be used also for hydrogen. I think that is very important, and that is also something that interfaces with the question of the medium. And I think that's something very important that the paper has flagged, and that perhaps we could discuss in more detail. One issue which the paper only indirectly addresses, but which I think is very important and is something that Rainer indirectly brought into discussion, is the issue of the industrial uses of hydrogen. This is something that we have been obviously discussing a lot in Germany. It would be interesting to see whether there is a market for that domestic use of hydrogen in the industrial sector in Russia, and whether anything has been done in Russia in that direction, and whether that could be an alternative to an export-oriented hydrogen strategy, which, as Aliaksei very clearly points, is not viable, at least in the short term. We know from some of the Bellona research that there is also possibilities for that market in Russia, but I don't know what is the state of the debate there and whether that is an alternative for the transition from an export-oriented emphasis to a domestic one. I just don't know, but I think that is also important to discuss. And staying within Russia, so I really like the fact that in the paper you have dedicated sections where you talk about the social political factors. I think that's really good and really important. In general, when you discuss that, when the paper is discussing that, it's about social political factors in Europe and acceptance or not acceptance of Russian fossil fuels and indirectly hydrogen. That is extremely important and interesting, but I wonder whether we should also include into our radar a discussion of social political factors within Russia itself. So right now, Russia is experiencing very deep changes within the country. It is facing a situation where demand of its fossil fuels may be falling down precipitously, which with very serious implications for its fossil fuel areas. There's some people who are arguing that the fact that a large number of workers in oil and gas companies were mobilized had to do with a preemptive action to prevent protests in that area. So this is a sector that is under stress because of that. This is a sector that is partially in areas that are that have great potential of ethnic mobilization as well. So how does that interface with the hydrogen question? I don't know the answer, but I think this is something that we need to look at, and we certainly need to look at the social political factors within Russia itself. Obviously, one of the most interesting and I would even say provocative parts of this paper concerns the discussion of China. And the discussion of China as perhaps a winner or clearly a winner from this situation. I would be a little bit more cautious perhaps in my expectations concerning the Russian-Chinese relationship. It is a relationship that if you look at it in a longer perspective has also a lot of potential for competition and conflict. I do not see it as only a support relationship. Of course, we have seen that since the beginning of the war, Russia has become more dependent on China economically. We have seen discussions of possibly the creation of Chinese directed or denominated obligations on the Russian side to finance to gain financing in the short term. So how does this growing Russian dependency on China fit in within this larger view of China receiving low-cost natural gas from Russia to use for hydrogen? I think it would be good, perhaps that could be a different paper, but this is a really important issue to kind of unpack the reality of that relationship and how it would affect different aspects of the hydrogen situation. So I am not so convinced that this is such a smooth relationship, and I think there's a lot to be discussed there. But obviously, the message concerning what this could mean for China is also a very serious message for the West, a very serious message for Europe at a moment when we are seeing a multiplicity of other ways in which Chinese actions are gaining a foothold in European infrastructure. These are extremely important questions to consider. I agree with Rainer Quitzow in acknowledging and being devastated by what this role of China and the exiting or the temporary exit of Russia from a global hydrogen strategy may mean in terms of climate issues. But I think this is something that perhaps could be developed in more detail. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you that you have to rewrite the paper. I think these are simply issues that you could develop in other papers, or that when you do presentations about the paper, you may emphasize in different presentations. And finally, I think one important question is, what does all of this mean for Ukraine herself? For Ukraine as a country that is the subject of a war of choice by Russia. Obviously, it's not a war that began in February 24th. It's a war that began 8 years ago. And what does this mean for Ukraine as a country that on the one hand will need a very large-scale reconstruction effort, and which, on the other hand, has some of the natural characteristics that may make it a good candidate for a robust carbon capture and storage investments, such as its tremendous natural gas storage facilities, for example. So these are kind of issues that are not fully addressed in the paper. I don't expect that any paper can address all these issues, but I think these are some issues that maybe we could discuss a bit more today, and certainly they are issues that are worth for attention looking forward. I learned a lot from your paper. I am very happy that you did it, and I hope that you will continue working on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita. I just want to reiterate, if anybody has any questions or comments, that they can please put them in the chat and we will pick them up and I will pass them on. Meanwhile, Alex, I mean, an awful lot to chew on there from these two feedback sources. I don't expect you necessarily to cover all of them, but do you want to respond to at least some of them, and then we'll just take it from there?
Yeah, we'll probably start with the potential domestic market for hydrogen in Russia. At least from the information I have from the documents I read, there was not really sort of domestic need to use hydrogen because they have so much of natural gas. You know, why use something more complex in terms of storage and transportation if you already have a pretty much well-developed gas sector? I'm not like, this is just the perception I got from most of the official documents and also the real projects on the ground. So that is probably why the hydrogen concept is strongly export oriented. So hydrogen in principle is just not the easiest substance to store and transport. That's why developing something within the country that will be a lot more expensive and might not necessarily have the advantages that natural gas doesn't have would not necessarily make any sense, in my opinion. But then also there's a question of gasification of households in Russia. Not all the households have been gasified. So why do you have to switch into something harder to deal with if you have not really done what you were supposed to do for your own citizens? That is just one of my intakes on just one of the insights I have for hydrogen use in Russia. So I don't really think, even if we look at the gas industry and gas sector in Russia, low rate of gasification could probably be explained by the export-oriented energy strategy in principle. Even the gas industry in Russia is very much tailored for the European markets and those people who do not really live in Russia. I'm not saying that natural gas is not used in Russia. I'm just saying that from the very beginning has not necessarily been tailored to its own citizens. So that probably says a lot about the country's approach towards how the energy sector should be developed. And I think by looking at it, we could also expect something with respect to hydrogen as well, because if we don't really see any sort of arguments, any clear rationale for hydrogen to be used within the country, I don't think they will artificially create that internal market just because it's too expensive. People don't really need it because they already have the means, much easier substances to deal with. And yeah, why do you have to reinvent the wheel if you already have that much of natural gas? That is just one of my comments. Speaking about the industries, with respect to, for instance, steel making, hydrogen is still at the very early stage of being sort of piloted as a fuel for steel making. As far as I know, I think it's only Sweden who has pioneered the process of green steel making with using green hydrogen to produce steel. And again, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on steel making. Most of the steel that is currently being produced is made in China using coal, and not all of those production processes could be easily substituted with hydrogen. Not all the coal can be technologically easy to substitute with hydrogen. But again, I'm not an expert in steel making. I would refer to one of my colleagues, Hassan Muslimani, who's done his PhD on CCS and steel making. So probably he'll be the best person to answer that question. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Can I just follow up, Alex, on one I think the point that Margarita was making especially, and it's just the China relationship in this, and to get away a little bit from the technical side to the political side, because this is kind of where you end on the paper as a sort of looking ahead part of the paper. Do we get the sense that, or do you get the sense that now with the war and this forced redirection of Russia towards Asia, that do you think that Russia is seeing hydrogen in the same way as as a source of leverage on China, eventually in the same way that it would have looked on in terms of its delivering it to Europe? Do you think that they will see it as useful political tools towards China? And on the back of this, I mean, what would be your prognosis? And that also goes for both of you, Rainer and Margarita, which is, there is a lot of potential for this, I mean, to be either politically binding between China and Russia, but it's also, there's a lot of potential of dependencies and creation of tension. So I think, could you maybe just dig a little bit more into how you might see this playing out?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. I think most of the information I got with respect to China and Russian hydrogen in China was from this so-called stress plan after the invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That was the stress plan that was published by the Russian Ministry of Energy. I don't really have that feeling that they have calculated everything and basically created that, you know, really perfect plan for the war, because as for now, I've only seen digits that have no really economic rationale, or at least not that much with respect to what has been created before. When it comes to China, I don't really think, as just explained in my paper, I don't really think that China will need to import that much of Russian hydrogen, just because, for instance, if we refer to the only pipeline that goes to China, it has not been even able to break even, just because the Chinese were able to secure long-term contracts at a really low price. I think right now, the numbers I've seen when it comes to the price for natural gas imported by China from Russia was something between 218 and 300 USD per 1,000 cubic meters, whereas Europe keeps importing Russian natural gas in the first half of the year. They kept importing Russian gas at prices over 800 USD per 1,000 cubic meters. So I don't think there's really any economic rationale at the moment for Russia to deal with China. So economically speaking, it's not really, Russia is not really benefiting from that relationship. So I think that the one thing we should understand about Russia is that, unfortunately for them and for the rest of the world, is Russia has not necessarily been a rational actor in most situations, at least in the past couple of decades, just because, as mentioned, even though the gas has been flowing to China since 2019, it's still, the cost is too low for the projects to break even. So I think it basically speaks volumes that, well, the project is there, the gas is flowing, it has been flowing for already 3-4 years, but the money has not been generated. You know, that's my perception of the situation at the moment. In the long-term perspective, as mentioned, I don't really feel the need for China to import a more complex and more sort of more expensive product from Russia when it can produce this project on the territory of China itself, creating jobs, and they do have the technology to create low carbon hydrogen or zero carbon hydrogen. They do have the capacity to produce electrolyzers. There's only one producer of electrolyzers, large scale producer of electrolyzers in Russia, but which cannot really compete with Europe or China. There's also no ongoing projects on carbon capture and storage in Russia, and China does have those projects that have been, you know, created and that they're operating at large scale. So I don't really think that China would need much more from Russia than just raw materials and fuel. Well, that's my, obviously I'm not saying I'm right, but that's how I feel about it.
Margarita, Rainer, do you want to come in on China a little bit more?
I will leave it at this, and I'm eager to hear Rainer's perspective.
I mean, I would first of all agree with Alex. I don't see China building a trade relationship based on hydrogen with Russia. I don't think there's any rationale for that whatsoever. I mean, they have the capacity to produce renewable energy in China, in parts of China. That could be the basis for climate neutral hydrogen production in China for Chinese industries. So why import hydrogen from Russia? Maybe, you know, in small amounts, or in certain areas it might make sense to do things like that, but basically also transport of hydrogen is not exactly an easy endeavor. So if you can do it at home domestically, you know, it makes more sense to do it there, and then the whole transport question isn't even sort of fully solved, you know. So maybe, you know, we'll see a hydrogen economy that is much more localized, in the sense that, you know, you have industries settling where there is access to hydrogen, and again, then the rationale for really importing a lot of hydrogen from Russia just simply isn't there for China. But I mean, I was very surprised to hear what Alex said. I didn't know that China, even before the war, but also now, is buying Russian gas at below break-even prices. I mean, when gas prices are spiraling out of control, let's say in Europe, but also to a certain extent have gone up significantly in other parts of the world, that China is getting this deal where you know, it's not even covering the cost of production and transport. So that's interesting. I do think, however, that, I mean, Russia has maneuvered itself into the position where it doesn't really have a choice other than developing, say, Asian markets for its gas, not just China. I mean, India is also buying gas currently from Russia, or oil and gas. I'm not even exactly sure what the gas interconnections are with India, but definitely oil at discounted prices. So that's the only thing left to do. So I think that's going to happen, and like I said, that will probably enable China to increase the amount of gas that it uses. What I would be interested, Margarita, in hearing more from you is, I mean, clearly there's the potential for tensions between China and Russia, because they're two, let's say, great powers that may be at odds in certain areas as they try to build regionally, you know, their influence also in Asia. But what are there any specific reasons that you think that we're going to see more conflict between the two going forward? Are there specific aspects that you see there? Because other than that, I mean, I would say that, you know, as I said, I mean, Russia has maneuvered itself into a position where it has already sort of started a conflict on its western border. So it would be a stretch to also start doing sort of getting into conflicts with its other big neighbor on the east. So you know, I mean, I would expect Russia to be careful when it comes to that relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Rainer, for raising that issue. Well, I'm not talking about a military conflict between Russia and China, although, as we know, there have been beginnings of those conflicts in the past. I am talking about a Russian carefulness about China. I'm talking about a certain mistrust going both ways. I'm talking about processes that have been going on for decades, if not centuries, concerning the control of southern Siberia. And more concretely, of course, I don't know how that would fit into the hydrogen story, but there is an ongoing Chinese-Russian competition in Central Asia. If we were discussing this issue a year ago, or even 7 months ago, or 8 months ago, perhaps that competition would not have seen so clearly. But when we look at the Shanghai group, and when we look at the way different Central Asian states are repositioning themselves vis-a-vis Russia, this also affects the relationship with China. So I'm not talking about a hot war, but I'm talking about very clear Russian sense that any relationship with China is maybe strategic, but may not be a long-term alliance. That is my perspective, at least looking at it in the long-term perspective. Alex, maybe you'd like to add something to this?
Sorry, I thought I was unmuted, excuse me. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry about that. Alex, do you want to quickly come back on anything that Rainer or Margarita just said, or otherwise I have another question for you?
I think just on a more general note, we've seen regime solidification in both Russia and China. I think this week we observed that President Xi Jinping just got re-elected, even though his predecessor did not really expect him to be re-elected. That was not the case before. I think that the so-called authoritarian like authoritarian alliance, or basically the alliance of those leaders who might feel threatened by democratization within the country, and basically, authoritarian leaders stick together. They have, at least in the past. I think that might be one of the reasons for Russia and China to be cooperating in the future. I'm not saying that does not exclude any potential conflicts, but I think Russia just doesn't seem to have any more alternatives at the moment. Chinese market is the only market for hydrogen, or basically energy, that could rival Europe, and that could rival, for instance, I mean, obviously not the US, because the US is too far away for hydrogen to be delivered, just because of the complexity of hydrogen transportation, but just because of the proximity and also similarity of the regimes. I think they seem to be natural allies at this point, which does not exclude any potential rivalry, any potential conflicts in the future. Just as Margarita said, we've already observed that in history, China and Russia have been at war. I think that the most recent conflict was in the 60s, if you correct me. That was a conflict not of the same scale as the ongoing war in Ukraine, but that basically says that even the most sort of friendly relationship could just turn into direct military engagement within just hours, or perhaps even minutes, if something goes wrong. So who knows?
Thank you. Rainer, you got your virtual hand up.
So many buttons to push here. Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, I was gonna follow up also with regards to another thing that Margarita said, that I was interested in her saying a little bit more about. You also mentioned the issue of social unrest or potential social unrest as a result of job losses in the fossil fuel sector in Russia. And I was interested if you could also elaborate on that a little bit, what exactly the developments are. I mean, I know, we all know, I think that, there's been a strong reduction of fossil fuel exports to Europe as a result of the war and the sanctions. But at the same time, these revenues are actually potentially even going up due to the price, the like strong increase in the prices. So maybe you can say a little bit more about what you were referring to.
Yes. As you may know, yes, as you may know, the Russian economic statistics just got a lot more murky, and there have been a lot of statistics that have not been coming out in the last couple of months. But the key point here is that, yes, there has been an increase in revenue, but we are going to be starting to see a lot of the effects on the sector starting next year, with the coming into effect of the European Union's embargo on vessel carried oil, on then later in February, embargo on refined oil products. So these are things that are going to be affecting the Russians, not only the Russian oil sector per se, but also the petrochemical sector. Now, we also know that a lot of that demand that may not be there in the European Union is now being replaced by some demand in China, in India, in Brazil. Nevertheless, some analysts are talking about the possibility of a decline of the sector in Russia. A lot of that is unclear. All I can say is that we have evidence that the mobilization has especially hit those sectors, in addition to ethnic majority sectors, which in a couple of cases coincide with oil producing areas such as in the North Caucasus. So this is simply something to keep in mind. And let's remember also that two of the most important oil producing and also refining areas in Russia, Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, have been especially affected by the mobilization. These are ethnic majority areas, Muslim majority areas, where a certain balance in the relationship with Russia has been maintained, not only because of the direct dependence of the regional presidents, because these are autonomous republics, from Putin and from Moscow, but also because of the sharing of revenue, of oil revenue. This is a longer story. Maybe it's not the time to discuss it now, having to do with different types of oil and the way this oil is exported and how the revenue is shared. But if there's going to be, starting next year, a decline in that revenue, that may also affect that relationship, and that can bring in further issues. I don't know how that connects directly with hydrogen, but it may mean possible mass unemployment in those sectors. And if that happens, maybe it will have some implications for hydrogen. I don't know the answer, but simply something to keep in the radar.
Thank you, Margarita. Alex, I just want to switch from east to west, the focus a little bit, because the other conclusion of the paper, of course, is not just about Russia-China relationship, but also, I mean, I think we've had a very interesting discussion about what it could or could not mean for China, but you work on the premise, nonetheless, that there is a possibility of China eventually becoming the hydrogen superpower or global hyperpower, as opposed to Russia that would have wanted to do this. And you asked the question, therefore, what does that mean for the Europe and the United States, the sort of transatlantic space or community? And you sort of end by raising the question, because again, it's not something that you can go into at length in this paper, about the need for the United States and Europe to eventually collaborate, to work together, to build their hydrogen sectors, to actually be able to avoid this fate where China, possibly, or to one degree or another, backed up by Russia, becomes the dominant hydrogen power globally. I wonder if you could maybe look a little bit more and talk a little bit more about the potential for this, because it seems to me that in the energy relationship between the United States and Europe, it's also not necessarily always going to be set to run on very smooth rails going forward. So there's also potentially, I think, tensions that will come up with this. So I wonder if you could, and also, of course, both you, Margarita and Rainer, to look a little bit more into this potential transatlantic US-Europe hydrogen future jointly. To what extent can it be joint? What are the sort of potentials and pitfalls that are coming, including, I think, political pitfalls? So we have elections coming up. I think the points that also have been raised about eventually a resumption post-war in some form or another of an energy relationship with Russia. So I think, could we talk a little bit more about that potential for transatlantic hydrogen growth?
A great question. I think I will leave the political part to Rainer and Margarita to discuss and basically comment, because I might not necessarily be the most knowledgeable in this respect. But when it comes to just pure technology and hydrogen concepts and basically strategies of the countries that comprise Europe and the European hydrogen strategy itself, well, it is clearly stated that hydrogen needs to be important. Apart from the domestic production, Europe will need to import hydrogen to basically meet the climate targets and the capacity targets, because simply relying on green hydrogen produced within Europe, Europe will not be able to decarbonize and build that at least local hydrogen economy, just because there's not enough capacity for electrolyzers to produce that amount of hydrogen that is needed for decarbonization, the transition of the industries. And there's also simply not necessarily enough capacity for renewable power to be able to generate that much energy, so that the sufficient amount of hydrogen could be produced. So Europe will need to import hydrogen anyways. They clearly stated in the strategy and Repower EU plan. The question is where to import it from. Obviously not Russia, because of everything that we have just discussed. But then from where? From Africa, from Chile, for instance. There's one suggestion to import it from Quebec in Canada. But what about the US then? US is also a little bit reactive in terms of developing its hydrogen strategy. I'm not saying they're not doing anything, but in terms of the legislations and in terms of looking at hydrogen that much optimistically as Europe is doing, they are a little bit lagging behind. But Europe is also the dominating power in the Pacific. If we lose, let's say, the US over there when it comes to that critical sector in the energy industry, it will most probably be taken by someone else more powerful, or at least at that more powerful at that point. And looking at the region, just like a helicopter view gives us China as the most probable substitute for the US. So given China has that authoritarian tendency to interfere within the political and social life of its neighbors, given its ambitions to become a regional player, a regional leader, I think that might mean that the US and Europe should perhaps cooperate on hydrogen to basically produce enough of it to feed the market, because otherwise it will be taken by someone else. That's just my general overview. I would love to hear what Margarita and Rainer think about it. So I think I would also leave that political side to them, because they might be a little bit more knowledgeable about it.
Yes, let me just add that this may be a very good moment for US-European cooperation concerning hydrogen. Just a month ago, the US Department of Energy released a draft plan for investing $6.5 billion on clean hydrogen hubs. This is just basically an announcement. They had just put out the first calls for demonstration projects, and I think this may be a very good interface with Europe. Unfortunately, I don't have the details about which are the technical requirements for their investments and how they would interface with the possibilities on the European side. Maybe this is something that Rainer knows more about, but if there has been a moment where this has been possible, it would be now after that investment, which is one of the largest in US clean energy history.
Yeah, I agree that this would be highly desirable for the EU and US to cooperate on hydrogen, maybe establish a sort of harmonized approach or standards for how to produce hydrogen, how to use it in certain industries where it can be used to decarbonize. I think the problem, however, is that, I mean, before the EU can become a strong partner for kind of within a transatlantic partnership, it really also needs to start working out some of the sort of disjunctures within the European Union, because there is a EU strategy. EU strategy includes imports as an important target. This is essentially mirrored in the German and the Dutch strategy, but not necessarily in all the other member states. I mean, there's France, for instance, has a very different perspective, a very different approach, doesn't really see hydrogen imports as sort of a priority, to say the least. Other countries like Poland, Germany's other big neighbor, it's the same story. I think Germany sort of lacks a little bit of credibility also right now for developing what is not only seen as sort of a necessary step towards decarbonization to import clean hydrogen, but also the creation of new dependencies. After Germany has insisted over the last decades to maintain this dependency on natural gas from Russia. Now Germany is sort of running ahead and wants to create new dependencies for the import of hydrogen, which doesn't necessarily sit well with a partner like Poland that isn't as ambitious when it comes to decarbonization. So So I think that unfortunately, one of the first steps for this would be to really find a common European approach. And sort of there's been some issues there with this big question of additionality, which is one of the questions for how, or the sort of the rules for how hydrogen can be produced to be considered green hydrogen, so that it can then also be utilized to meet certain decarbonization targets. This has been called into question by the European Parliament due to some of the different opinions, and not alone also because of the move that happened in the US, which is much more pragmatic and very ambitious. So this is putting a lot of pressure on Europe to maybe hopefully get its act together and define an approach. And but I do agree, yes, I mean, it's the right time to collaborate not only on hydrogen, but also on decarbonization of industry more broadly. Ultimately, it isn't about hydrogen, it's about decarbonizing industrial processes. And I see here a really scope also for working together. We've talked about climate clubs. I think industrial decarbonization could be one area where sort of cooperation along the lines of some kind of a climate club might make sense, defining common standards for that, defining standards for also final products that use those industrial goods like steel in car making, for example. So I think there's, yeah, many avenues for cooperation, and it would be nice if this could become an area of closer collaboration, because obviously it's always difficult to harmonize and adapt standards in areas where they already exist, where they're already in place, and somebody has to change the existing paradigm. Here we have an area where there's going to be an entirely new set of standards, a new area of also technological development. So there is actually scope for them collaborating and setting common standards.
Thank you, Elena. I have, I think, a final question, which I want to tie a couple of things back to you, Alex, and then, of course, both to you also, Margarita and Rainer. So, Alex, I think Margarita, I think it was who mentioned the impact of sanctions on the ability now or in the near future of Russia to export, the ability to produce. I think there's possibly also a broader question of the economic impact and the financial impact of the war on Russia. So if we could sort of project ourselves to a scenario, say, without putting a time frame on it, but let's say hypothetically, like 2 years from now, where there's been some sort of end to the war in Ukraine, or a settlement of some sort, if not quite an end, where does that leave then Russia as, in terms of its ability to restart itself on the sort of, on its ambitions to be a hydrogen exporting power? And where does that leave then also, I think, the question of Europe, in terms of there will be obviously economic costs that have been endured by Europe over the last year, probably the next couple of years are also not going to be necessarily economically easy for Europe. There's going to be the decarbonization agenda that will be still strong. So once there are also some voices saying, well, you know, we've reached a settlement in the war, there's going to be some pull to try and, on both sides, possibly on the Russian side and on the European side, to resume some sort of energy importing, exporting relationship. So where would you see the ability of Russia to be in that position to restart its ambitions after a settlement a couple of years from now? And collectively, where do we see how this might actually play out in Europe? I think, granted, the United States might be a little bit out of that equation to a certain degree. So I'll go with Alex first, and then if Margarita and Rainer want to come back on that, that would be great.
That's a great question. I don't think I may have a clear answer to that because no one really knows what the future would look like after the war. We obviously hope and we do believe in Ukraine's victory. That also, the Ukraine's victory also means that Russia will have to pay reparations. And that is, it's not something just, you know, like a couple of €1,000, or that billions, if not trillions of USD or euros, depending on how long this war will last. Obviously, that will be a huge burden for the population, for Russia's economy. and in principle, that would mean that Russia will be in deep trouble. It is in deep trouble right now, but they'll be in more deep trouble economically speaking after the war. So the speed of build-up of Russia's hydrogen economy or hydrogen industry, if it ever happens, would depend on that factor, and also on the speed of international companies helping with that build-up. Because as mentioned, Russia does not simply have the technology to develop some forms of hydrogen at the extent they should be developed to be able to export it. For instance, green hydrogen, Russia is significantly lagging behind in terms of electrolyzer production. That means it will need to, for instance, buy electrolyzers for someone who is very much skilled at producing electrolyzers. And at the moment, Europe is the world's leader in terms of electrolyzer production. When we focus just on blue hydrogen, because if, in principle, this discussion is all about decarbonization and reducing carbon footprint. Because if we are talking about just efficiency, fossil fuels are almost perfect in this respect. We don't have to substitute them if we don't think about decarbonization and saving the planet, because fossil fuels are a lot easier to handle, a lot easier to deal with, and a lot easier, to trade. So another factor to consider would be the green agenda in general, whether European countries and world leaders will be serious enough to pursue it in the long-term perspective. Hopefully there will be, because that's what we should probably do to save the planet. But imagine some leader comes into power in some of the leading European economies and thinks that, climate change is a scam and we don't really need to care about the emissions. Why not just keep, importing Russian gas or importing Russian fuel just after the war? So there are a lot of uncertainties. I don't think I can answer that question and predict the future, but I think those are the factors that one should consider thinking about the end of the war and the post-war order in Europe and in the world in general.
I'd like to just follow up on this briefly. I think the points that Alex has made concerning the impact of those reparations on Russia are really, really important. And this just raises two issues. One is, are we going to see a situation where Western countries will have to extend a helping hand, not only to Ukraine, but also to Russia to stabilize the region? Kind of looking at the lessons of the First World War, and how will this interface with climate goals? I could only imagine this happening if there is a direct benefit that could be gained climate-wise from this. But again, we are seeing a situation where a lot of things are in question marks for Russia as well. This war of choice is destroying not only Ukraine, but also Russia. And we are going to see huge impacts in the years to come. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you. Rainer.
Yeah, I would just kind of add, it's really obviously hard to answer that question because there's so many unknowns, like Alex said, but I think, so it's interesting maybe to consider some of the unknowns that would make a difference. And one is, of course, what kind of a Russian government or regime would be in place at what time in the next 10, 20 years. We don't know how long this war will be going on. Potentially it could drag on for a while. And what it will actually do to the Russian regime. So if we have a completely different regime in place, the situation would obviously be much different from dealing with the existing regime, potentially stabilized for whatever reason after the war. Another question I think that makes a big difference is, if we're talking, say, a time horizon of 5 to 10 years, how far along will Europe be in not just decarbonizing, but sort of deploying renewables, developing other solutions, and sort of getting away from the fossil fuels that it's currently or has been importing from Russia. So I think the ambition is to accelerate that phase out of those fossil fuels as a result. not just to decarbonize, but also to reduce dependencies in general in that area. So yeah, that will also make a difference. And but that said, yeah, to be honest, I think that apart from fossil fuels, I mean, there's the critical raw materials or just whole spectrum of raw materials that Europe could potentially import from Russia and still does import from Russia, that would also be subject to this renewed relationship. And so, yeah, I think either which way we turn, there will have to be some re-engagement between Europe and Russia at some point. And I think ultimately, you know, if the sanctions end, if relations somehow normalize, I mean, the private sector will go into that space and relaunch relationships. So I think that's sort of the easy answer to the question, I guess.
Thank you very much. Alex, do you have any final words that you would like to share before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, just to wrap up and basically say that we do hope that Ukraine will win, and glory to Ukraine. That's it, I think.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to thank both Margarita and Elena for taking the time for providing comprehensive and very enlightening comments. I think they were useful to Alex, but also to me and to all our listeners, I'm sure. Thank you, especially Alex, for your work on this paper. As I mentioned, it went through some difficult periods as a result of the war changing the parameters of your research project quite drastically at the beginning of this year. But I'm very glad that we were able to put this paper together and to publish it. I remind you that it is on the GMF website at the moment. You are able to get the link from the chat function while we are still here. On that note, I will say thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at further GMF presentations of future papers in our ReThink.CEE collection or program. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.